all of it's done with passion I had. I loved comics. I loved movies. When I was a kid growing up in Milwaukee, I never went to film school. I'm an art major. I had no connection to New York. But I just always felt that given the chance, well, sometimes you have to go and create your own chance.
Good morning and welcome back to 5 a.m. Story Talk, a place to talk about stories in all their forms, the craft that goes into them, and the role that art plays in our lives. The mellifluous voice in your ears right now belongs to me, your host, Cole Haddon, screenwriter, novelist, podcaster, obviously, and infrequent comic book writer. I haven't talked much about the comic books part of my life and passion for storytelling, but it's relevant to this episode because today's guest is Mike Richardson, the founder and CEO of Dark Horse Comics, the source of some of the most influential comic book series in my life, and I expect a lot of my listeners. Mike published my first comic book series back in 2011, The Strange Case of Mr. Hyde, which imagined a scenario where 5 years after the events of the Robert Louis Stevenson novel, Mr. Hyde and a young Scotland Yard inspector hunt Jack the Ripper across London. It remains one of the coolest things I've ever done as an artist, and I know MS Corley, who was behind the art for the series, feels the same. I don't bring this up as self-promotion, but as an opportunity to discuss inflection points in careers and lives. Sliding door moments, I guess you might say. A couple of months ago, I told you about how I sold my first script in Hollywood and what it taught me about working with people, specifically representatives, who don't want to represent the writer you are rather than the one they want you to be. If you haven't listened to it yet, you can find a link to that episode in the show notes, or just scroll through this podcast's episode list to the minisode entitled What I Learned from My First Hollywood Script Sale. In this minisode, I referenced another project I had pitched these same reps. Good guys, I'll reiterate, just not good reps for me. This other project was called Hyde. After I moved on from those reps, I pitched Hyde to several producers. One of them was Keith Goldberg, who helps run Dark Horse Entertainment, Dark Horse's film TV production arm. Keith jumped at the idea, which is one of the many reasons I call him one of my favorite producers in Hollywood. Being brilliant at story is another. Seriously, if you ever have the chance to work with him, jump at that opportunity. Keith got me in a room with Mike, which was a thrill because we're talking about Dark Horse Comics here. I mean, guys, this is the publisher who gave the world comics like Hellboy, Grendel, The Umbrella Academy, Sin City, The Mask, The Goon, Concrete, and so many more. Those are all original titles, of course. Dark Horse also revolutionized adapting Hollywood films for comics, expanding their universes in exciting ways. Aliens, Predator, Terminator, The Thing, Godzilla, Indiana Jones, even Star Wars. It's crazy, but a lot of these brands would have withered had Dark Horse not kept them vital for fans. Hollywood paid attention too, even going so far as to reverse engineer what Dark Horse was doing back to the big screen for films like Alien vs. Predator, and in the case of Star Wars, regularly mining the work done at Dark Horse for characters and storylines that would then show up on screens as early as Attack of the Clones. What I mean is, when I sat down with Mike for the first time in 2010 or so, it felt like I was sitting down with a titan who had helped make some of the coolest stories in my life happen. That he then said he wanted to publish my film pitch as a comic book? Well, this blew my mind. We went on to sell the script to David Ellison at Skydance Entertainment. David's in the process of buying Paramount right now, which I think we should all be happy about. This guy loves film, and I don't know if I would say that about a lot of people running Hollywood studios today. That was one hell of a pitch experience, by the way. David's offices were at Santa Monica Airport at the time, next door to Harrison Ford's hangar, and halfway through the pitch, Ford just jogs out into view, and I'm like, cool. I'm just going to act like that's not Harrison Ford right now and keep pitching this film idea of mine, even though I'd rather get David to introduce me to my childhood hero instead. I somehow sold Hyde despite Ford trying to ruin it for me. It's a good thing too, because the script wound up on the blacklist, and that really changed my life because suddenly every production company in Hollywood wanted to meet with me. It directly led to me selling several more projects over the next few years, including a TV pilot called Dracula that got produced in 2014 and really made my career. In a way, you might say Mike and Keith changed my life, which Mike and I will discuss in a bit. But what really changed my life was trusting my own instincts, as I discussed in that minisode I cited. I knew I had good ideas in my pocket, so I trusted myself rather than my reps, and when my reps repeatedly couldn't appreciate what I was doing, I parted ways with them. I sold Thieves of Baghdad and then Hyde because of that faith in myself. Mike Richardson, as you'll learn during my conversation with him, repeatedly trusted himself too when common sense would have suggested other paths in his career. These inflection points transformed his life and all of American comic book publishing. Okay, let's start wrapping this up. A few more biographical details here. Mike isn't just the founder of Dark Horse Comics. He opened Pegasus Fantasy Books in 1980, and by 1993 he changed the name to Things from Another World. There are 11 of these, let's call them Nerd Heavens, across the country today. Dark Horse Entertainment spun off from Dark Horse Comics in the 90s and is responsible for countless films and TV series from Hellboy to The Umbrella Academy. And through it all, Mike has also written numerous comic book series, including many film spin-offs and adaptations I praised earlier, and he created The Mask. What I love about the conversation I have with Mike is how much it just feels like sitting down with a legend who's seen and done it all, and asking him to tell you some stories about how it all happened and what it was like. When today's episode is done, you're going to want to stick around for the bonus episode, as always, because Mike's going to come back to discuss a seminal piece of art from his life, albeit with a twist. He's going to dive into his relationship with the oeuvre of artist Frank Frazetta, who's sometimes called the godfather of fantasy art. Don't forget, you can find links to everything discussed in today's episode, as well as to the 5 a.m. Story Talk newsletter in the show notes. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them for you. And lastly, a favor. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and/or review it wherever you're listening to it. It's a great zero-cost way to help me get the show in front of more ears. Obviously, I hope you subscribe to 5 a.m. Story Talk too, whether at a podcast app or at the newsletter, which is currently hosted at Substack, whichever one is right for you. And now, let me introduce you to my friend, Mike Richardson. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to see you. How's life in Portland going? You grew up there, correct?
Yeah, I grew up here, grew up in Portland, moved to Milwaukee when I was just about to turn 5, and Milwaukee, Oregon is where we're located. We have like 8 of the properties around Main Street, which we've grown into. We leased a larger building. We're shrinking some of those locations into that. I've grown up here. It was farm country. It was Italian farm country when I grew up. It was interesting because on one side of the hill, it was Italian farmers along Lake Road. But if you go on the other side of the hill, it was Japanese farmers who we never saw.
I always think of Portland as such an artist enclave, but it wasn't back then, was it? Did you just convince everybody to move to Portland?
People can take all the exception they want. We can pretty much point to who brought somebody else who brought somebody else. But no, there wasn't any real comic book industry at the time. There was a convention that came. I remember the cover of I saw the cover of their program, and I said, let me just do something for you. Okay, that's really awful. So I did it. I did a Conan-esque thing, and then they printed it in pink paper, which was offensive right off the bat. I mean, but that's how they did things. They probably got a deal on the paper. I don't know. It was called Nova. But the good thing about Nova is I used to meet people. I met Jim Steranko at Nova, and nobody was going back. Here he had all his shadow paintings out, and there was nobody in there. So I just walked in. We sat down and talked for about 45 minutes. He says he remembers. He doesn't remember, but he remembers going to Portland, I'm sure. He says, well, how could I? You're 6'9". How could I forget you, But anyway, that was about it. There wasn't really anything else around. One of the things that I did, one of the people that went to Portland State, where I went to college, so I didn't meet him while I was in school, but met him later through Randy Stradley, was the guy that started APA 5. Before the internet, there used to be APAs, and I don't know, there were APAs on coins, for instance, and that's how fans would get together and they'd publish what they knew, and you'd get all your people that were a member of your APA to submit sections, and then you had a central mailer who put it all together in like a black and white magazine type thing. And Mark started APA 5, which is the first comic book app. In fact, it's funny, I'm talking about that. I've been showing people. I just found one of the covers that I drew on the counter of the Beaverton store where we'd pasted, and that was a cover, and I was penciling it, and Chris Warner walked in. I said, hey, ink this for me. And so this is one of the first Dark Horse collaborations in APA 5,
That's great.
When I decided to start publishing, I knew where this treasure trove of talent was. I was just sitting. So it was Paul Chadwick and Randy Stradley and Chris Warner and Mark Badger and Frank Miller, by the way, was a member, although I didn't get him early on at Dark Horse, got him later. There were dozens of people that ended up working in the comic business in this APA, where there are only 50 members, a wait list for people to get in as soon as somebody dropped out. And of course, Mark Verheiden did well, not only in the comics, but went on to be a great writer he was my partner writing on The Mask and Time Cop.
A bigger question is, I guess, when what we officially consider geek culture started, which for me is, in my mind, always started with the launch of comic book shops, which you were there for the start of. We're now talking 45 years later. Does it ever baffle you that it's become so big? Did you think this was possible?
I never thought about it that way. I wanted to do something I wanted to do. Look, my mom was a comic book fan as a kid. And so she got married very young. So she'd bring comics home. And I wanted to know what was in those things. I see the pictures and I look at the pictures. So I demanded that she help me learn how to read so I could read those things. When I went into the first grade, I was reading. I mean, and I got asked one time, how was school? And I said, well, I was always bored. And they said, when did that start? I said, well, on the first day of school, first grade, they passed around Fun with Dick and Jane. And I read it while I literally read the whole book while they passed it up and down the aisles. I was in a parochial Catholic school, and they had like 50 kids a class with one teacher. One nun taught all classes. And when my sophomore year, I went to public school, and I never studied after that because we were so far ahead, after that. So those nuns, dedicated person, it sort of showed me what a dedicated person, because then you get to the other schools and you get a bunch of teachers teaching different things. Well, at the Catholic school, one teacher taught it all and did pretty good. And you had to learn. No exception. You didn't pass if you didn't learn. So the idea of not passing was not accepted. But anyway, they passed the book around, or the books around to everybody. I read it while they were passing it out. And so when did I get bored? Probably about an hour into the first day of the first grade, because then I had to sit there and wait for people to learn how to read. And I was always trying not to, I was sort of embarrassed by it because school was easy for me. And I was always embarrassed to I don't know why. I was just embarrassed by.
During this stretch, did you continue to read comic books? Because I know you're a sports guy too, and the two culturally, they kind of reject each other in some way, or at least publicly. People weren't bragging about their love of comics when they were playing basketball.
Yeah, no, I played sports, all the sports in grade school. It was a Catholic school. So if you didn't play every sport, you were sort of out of it because it was Italians. They were all Italian. Our head coach, Louis Chergino, I mean, you had to be, so you'd start out with football and then you'd move to basketball, then you'd move to track, then you'd move to baseball, then you'd start with football, and it was every year like that. So, no, I always stayed in it, played basketball in college, and I kept on playing afterwards with a team, a AAU team with a lot of ex-Blazers on it. And you travel around and you played, and right up until a few years ago, until before COVID, we were traveling around to tournaments. Afterwards, we couldn't put our team together anymore. So I still work out every day. And a year ago, about a year, maybe a year and a half ago, a friend of mine who's all Pac-12 and called me and said, we're going to ride a bike for charity. And I said, I haven't been on a bike for 20 years. I used to be an Oregon wheelman. We used to ride bikes everywhere, but hadn't done it for 20 years. And he said, no, we're going to ride from Salem, Oregon, 80 miles over the Pacific Coast Range to Pacific City on the ocean for charity. And I said, okay, let's try it. So we did like a 20-mile test, no problem. 75 to 80 miles, different story. Especially, we drove it. I made him drive it the day before just to be sure that I could make it, because that distance was in the hills. Going over the mountain range was intimidating. But I found that it was about half, 35, 37 miles uphill and about the same downhill. So that's great. It's the downhills there. That's great. But I found out it's all uphill. Anybody who wants to do something like it's all up here. Why? Because it'll take you 10 minutes of hard work to get to the top and about 30 seconds to the bottom, and then there's another hill. So there is no recovery going down. You're just headed for the next hill. And it was probably the toughest thing I ever did. But I did beat and he doesn't like it when I say that, but I did beat the youngster. Of course, I waited until we got about 100 yards away and just went all out. So on the film, I would go shooting by him as we crossed the finish line. So that's the way I am. Sorry.
Well done. Uh, I had ankle reconstruction surgery last year to get back into playing sport. And as soon as it was repaired, I threw a rubber ball to my kids and tore my rotator cuff. So, so at the moment I'm listening to you at 48, feeling really bad about myself. With comic books, what was your relationship with those through high school? We'll get into college because I think at that point you start transitioning or heading toward the dark horse of it. But I'm curious, during high school, and did your mother continue to encourage it?
Not really. She didn't really encourage it. She just had him around. It's not that my mother was encouraging, and my dad, to some extent, he worked all the time. He had a hard life. Finally retired, and then died a couple weeks later. His first check came the week after he died. His first retirement. He had government retirement, which was really great. He was looking forward to it.
Sorry.
It's a lesson in life. He never really got to enjoy his life. But anyway, he was a mechanic and had 6 kids, and we never knew we didn't have anything because all the families were pretty much the same in our neighborhood. And my mom just had the comics around, and I saved them. They'd read them, and then once they were done, I got to come in and take them. And so I had boxes and boxes of comics, and I started collecting them probably when I was, aside from those, I mean, seriously collecting them when I was about 8. And I was there, I remember walking in, and so I knew the different stores where they were. So down here at where Dark Horse is, by the way, our first office is where I bought my first comic books.
Is that a coincidence?
No, it's intentional. It came for sale, and I said, I want that Karma or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so
Wow.
we operated, it was a drugstore that had a huge comic book rack. And so it had all the things you would expect. It had DCs, Archies, the more mainstream comics. There was no Marvel then. There was Atlas, the monster comics, and the early Tales of Suspense and Journey into Mystery, which were monster anthologies back then. Then across the street, they had some oddball things. That's where I found my first EC book in a pharmacy right across the street. It was called The Autumn People. And it was in the paperback section, but near the comics. And it was reprints of EC comics. And so that's when I first, what's EC? There's no way to know this stuff. So you just file it away. It's like the Duck books. That's an amazing coincidence with all comic readers because in my own head, I'd look and I'd say, oh, that's not the good artist. And then it turned out years later, I think it was in Roy Thomas's book that he started about the good duck artist, that all these people had this experience of looking for the good duck artist. And I had that, looking for the good artist. So this is this thing in the mindset that was floating through the air. And people had the same experience, but those were the best books and looking for them. But they picking up those books over there, and the meat market had spin racks of the Atlas stuff, bags. A meat market had 3 for a quarter, and you could look and see, and you'd get Millie the model in the middle of some book you had to have, and that's where the Captain, the one by Ditko, not Captain Midnight, but Captain Atom, it was Charlton, but it didn't have the big Charlton label on it. They were beautifully drawn. I mean, that's where I learned Ditko before Spider-Man was in these Captain Atom books. And if you drove out McLaughlin, you could get the Archie Mighty Hero selection out there. So, but that's a mile. I had to take my bike up in the main thoroughfare up to Fudo Mart. And then you had Lou's Market, which had a smattering of all of them. But if you went up 32nd, way to the top, there's a little grocery store. And it's there that I found some really interesting things. One, picked up this comic called The Hulk, and it looked like Frankenstein on the cover. And that's what I thought. It was some ripoff of Frankenstein. So I took it. And then I saw Journey into Mystery with Thor. And I'd wait a minute, that's not a superhero. That's a Norse god. This is before they were called Marvel, by the way. Then the Fantastic Four was somewhere in there. And they didn't have costumes. the first two issues, no costumes. And that blew, what's going on with this company? All this weird stuff. And then Spider-Man #1. I remember with that. So those started going. Fantastic Four got some costumes. And so those started going. But then Spider-Man #1 showed up. Blew my mind. It was, I had to read that comic over and over. And who knows? You know, it's just things connect with you at a certain age. So I got into collecting every comic. And I had, my whole closet was filled with boxes of all these comics, runs of every Marvel, runs of Superman and Batman, not from the beginning, but from when I was, the late 50s, I guess. And while I was away, one of my friends had seen that I had all these comics. While I was gone, he drove up with a truck and told my brother he was supposed to take them all. So my brother helped him load up his truck and off he went, never saw him again, which was heartbreaking to me.
Yeah.
And I couldn't look at comics after that. I literally couldn't. Went into college, I was an art major in college. I majored in art. Started my own commercial art business while I was in art school or while I was at Portland State. Anyway, I walked into this. They had books and they had art supplies. It's called J.K. Gill's. And when I was a kid, my mom, because I was reading from the beginning, and so starting very early on, she started buying me the Ace F-Series Burroughs books, Tarzan. My dad gave me his first hardcover copy of the first edition of Tarzan in book form. Princess of Mars, excuse me, not the Tarzan, the Princess of Mars. So I knew Edgar Rice Burroughs from that, and I loved that book. So she started buying me all these unauthorized Ace F series because the Ballantine was the authorized, but they had the sort of modern art covers, which the Ace F series had. Frazetta, that's how I knew Frazetta when I was a kid, because he did the covers of a lot of these. And Roy Krinkle, we're doing a art book on the history of Roy Krinkle right now. So I knew Frazetta from that, just this mysterious name, the covers, and a little pen and ink drawing in the front of the book. So I had to have all those. I now have every Ace F-Series book, even though they aren't all Frazetta. But I'm walking through J.K. Gill's while I'm in college, and across the thing, I see this thing I could see it, I'm 20 feet away, but I saw the paperback sitting there, and it was Frazetta. It was Tarzan on the back of an ape, but they called him Conan, and it was the Rogues in the House story. And I picked that up, and I said, wow, they're ripping off Tarzan. This is Frazetta, too. But I bought the book because it was Frazetta. Read it, never had read a sword and sorcery book. So then I started buying all the Conan books. And of course, that was when the reason that book even came out is because Lord of the Rings had come out. And then that was such a success. Every fantasy book, you weren't around then, but every fantasy book that had ever been written was done trying to cash in it. So you'd go in and it's just rows of fantasy books. And Conan was one of those.
At the time, did the people who were reading it, was there the sense of what by the 80s we were calling nerds? Was there a sense that you were on the outside of normal culture, that you were fringe in some way?
I mean, I never allowed myself to be pigeonholed. In high school, I had all kinds of friends, and nobody was too low or nobody was too high. I didn't care. I hung out with everybody. I never thought that way. I just never did. It never occurred to me. First of all, I never thought of myself as a nerd, so right off the bat, didn't matter. I was good in sports. I went from a Catholic school. One of my only regrets in life is that I went from a Catholic school at Central Catholic, the school I went to. I was like on the varsity track team as a freshman. And I go to public school and there's girls and parties, and I got sidetracked and I didn't get back on the athletic trail, even though I still played on teams. I walked off the basketball team because I wouldn't cut my hair. They wanted crew cuts and I wouldn't do it. Big mistake. Who cares, But then I cared. I can't imagine. And by the time I came to my senses in my senior year, it was too late, basically. And so then when I went to college, of course, I played sports and went back and did track and all of that stuff while I was there. But never thought of it that way. Finishing the story about, though, the Frazetta thing. So I saw this book and I took it home. So I started buying all those Conan books and with the Frazetta covers, most of them. And my brother told me there was a Conan comic. And so I picked it up, the first issue, and I looked at it. For the life of me, I can't see this happened a lot. that I don't know what attracted me because they became so much better, but Barry Windsor Smith did that comic. It was very, there's Kirby-ish and really not the Smith we knew later, but something about it, I had to see Barry Smith all the time. And so every issue, if you followed those, was a huge leap. Barry just got better and better and better and better until he's doing these magnificent. Song of Red Sonja is one of the best, greatest illustrated comics ever in my mind. It's a beautiful romantic period art that he was influenced by the Art Nouveau. I felt he was influenced by all the things that I liked and done so exquisitely. He had these marks that I was certain that he used to do these design marks that when I got to know him later, I said, I even saw how you used your brush to do that. I figured out how you were doing it. He says, no, I drew those marks. Like, oh, see, so you just learn stuff constantly. Anyway, so I just started adding artists. And it was like in the 70s, it was like this explosion of a whole new wave of artists coming in that I could see a lot of them, the influences and stuff of actual artists on the comics that they did. And it just got me back into comics. So I started collecting again, originally by art. And then, of course, I started collecting some of those that my favorites as a kid. I always looked for an excuse to get back into something. So if a particular artist did a guest issue, I'd start collecting it again. The result is I've now got a secret room that I built in the house to last me the rest of my life. And it filled up in about a year, about 18 months. It's completely full of boxes. So
Is it an actual secret room?
nobody would ever find it in the house. And it's like 3 rooms full of stuff.
So the decision to open a bookshop focused on this, where was that just born of this passion for it? The reason I'm asking this is that when I look back at the history of your career, there were always these really interesting moments of innovation. The first is deciding to launch bookshop that caters to people who love what you do in a market that I don't think I didn't have any of those around me until I was in my teens in Michigan.
Look, I always wanted to start my own business. While I was in college, I started my own commercial art business. I answered an ad one day. I was looking to make some cash in the help wanted section. Remember newspapers? And it said wanted artists to do line drawings for a toy company. So it was the Ralph Bear Toy Company. So I went and answered, and he gave me all these toys to draw. So I drew him little line drawings that he put in his catalog. And so he gave my name to other people who gave my name to other. Pretty soon I'm doing all these jobs. And when I got out of college, I was going to start Dark Horse Graphics. Why? Because Dark Horse is the person that could win, but nobody really knows about. You have to really understand, oh, we're going to bet on that Dark Horse, So I was going to do Dark Horse Graphics. A friend of mine, while we were out, his wife said, look, you know so much about comics and you're collecting. Why don't you do something with that? And somehow, when an idea clicks, I started thinking about it. And while I was at work one day, and by the way, I would be doing the job that I got hired by was as a commercial artist. I was doing box covers for furniture. I was doing silk screening for their big presentations. The worst thing I was doing, though, a lot of my time was doing instruction sheets, how to put furniture together, which was torture because you had to get everything exactly measured just right. And so I was doing that. Then at night, I'd be at home doing other stuff. As a matter of fact, my boss, one day I was in his office and he said, because in those days, they thought if you had a college education that you were smart. They actually thought that you had something. Anyway, I had a college education, so I sort of got the run of the place, and it was a blue-collar place. And I was sitting in my boss's office, one of the co-owners, and he had to do this silk screening. And I can't remember, 10,000 clocks, something like that, with 3 colors. And when he was done, and he was going to pay something like $1 a clock. So it was substantial money. I said, save all that money, and I'll just do it. And he said, you can do that? I said, sure, I can do that. So he called him and canceled the order. And he said, how much do you think you need? And I said, oh, a couple $100. I went out that night and bought a book on silk screening because I had no idea how to silk screen. But I was an art major, and I used to walk by the room where I saw them squeegeeing. And I thought, if these guys can do it, I can certainly do it. So then I found out it costs quite a bit more than $200 to get all the equipment. So I had to make up my own equipment. So I had them give me, they had railroad cars on the property. So I had them give me a railroad car as an office and said, just leave me alone in here and I'll get the clocks out. So made little forms to drop the clock shapes in. Well, first of all, I had to learn how to do the film and do it. So I find out hi-fi green and you put the black over it. And when ultraviolet light hits the hi-fi green, it turns it so you can wash it away with hydrogen peroxide or hardens it with hydrogen peroxide. And then wherever the black line is, that washes away. So you have your screen to push your ink through with a squeegee. Okay, easy enough. I use my bathtub at home. My wife will still talks about it, about me taking over the bathroom. So you put a form in. I put my clock in. Oh, by the way, and I found out what an ultraviolet light cost. It was $75 or something. And I went around and asked some people because I need ultraviolet. He told me a photo flood bulb number 2, the light bulb lasts for a certain amount of time, but you get a half hour of ultraviolet light. And the bulbs cost like 89 cents. So instead of buying the expensive thing, I bought like a couple dozen photo flood number 2 bulbs. And I had little tape on them to say how much time was left on them of 30 minutes. So I'd use one, then use the next one, and then I'd go back to the first one and go through. And that was my ultimate light system. On the day of that we were supposed to have it done, was like 3 months. I had the heisters come and deliver 10,000 clocks, whatever the number was. It was a lot. And then I was the hero because I saved him all that money. Got a nice promotion, raise, and I got raised to $19,000 a year, which I went home and told Carrie, you know what, we're going to be able to buy that $100,000 house someday, because it wasn't that long ago that a $100,000 house was the top of the line, you know. Anyway, this woman that I talked about had put this idea in my head. And one day I got balloons hooked to a teddy bear that said, you're a dad. So I did what any dad would do. I walked in and quit my job right on the spot. My wife was the secretary of the president of Bank America at the bank she was at. I told her, you got to quit her job because I've decided I'm going to go down and open a shop with science fiction and comic books. And she said, okay. So we went down there and I found a 400 square foot space, and that became, I kept putting names in and the state kept rejecting them. I wanted to be WonderWorks and they wouldn't let me. And I just went down this list, and finally I put like 10 things. The very bottom one was Pegasus Fantasy Books. And that's the one they picked, of course, the very last one that I put on. So we were Pegasus Fantasy Books, and we had a big Pegasus sign, which was sort of fun. We could have fun with the images and use them and advertise in the theaters and all of that down in Bend, Oregon, which is a desert town. Now, why did I decide to do that? Everybody thinks it's such an amazing choice that I would go ahead and do that, but it's because I like this stuff. So I figured there had to be other people that like this stuff. And wouldn't it be nice to come into the store with a cash register instead of a tackle box, which a lot of those early shops that sold comics, and to have professional handouts and all of that stuff. So we did all that. We ran it like a real store. Didn't put Wolverine in, but put stuff that would draw ladies in also. So we get a broader market. So if there's something that came in, we'd put that in the window that was more attractive to women, because you get the fanboys. If they know there's comics there, you're going to get them. I don't think you need to put Wolverine in the window to attract traditional comic fans. In those days, comic market was 90% plus of males. Women were the small part of it. What changed that was first anime, and then those anime viewers going into manga, and that became the driving force for comics growth in the bookstores, where many times the number of sales ended up going through bookstores as opposed to comic shops. But anyway, at one time we ended up with 12 stores. I had 12 stores in 3 states. But in the meantime, writers and artists would come down and sign their work, and they would tell me that they didn't get to own it once they signed all the rights. And why would you do that? Well, because we want to do comics. Well, that gave me the idea, well, what would happen if a publisher came along that said, you keep your work, I just want to be a partner with you, and we'll take care of the business side and you take care of the art side. So we started getting some really well-known people. I had started the comics store I opened my first one January 1st, 1980. And Dark Horse finally came along 1986. We started planning it. I took another APA 5 guy, Randy Stradley. He was a talented writer. And I said, you be the editor and I'll be the publisher. Had no idea what editor and publishers did. Previous to that, my friends had performed what do you call it, intervention, a real intervention. They came down and the women took my wife out and the guys took me and they said, we have to stop by this motel and where they were staying, or hotel where they were staying while they were down in Bend. And I sat down and they surrounded me and you've got to quit this crazy idea. You got to go ask for your job back. They knew they were trying to get me to come back. And I was arguing with them. And finally, after, I don't know, hour and a half, I finally said, you're right. You're right. I'll go back. I lied. I just wanted to go out and have some beer that night. So then I started the publishing company. I decided to start the publishing company where creators could be protected. We started it with what we called a creator rights platform, where they own the material that they and control the material that they created, which seemed only fair. You know, the first group of people that we did, we pasted them up. The first issue of Dark Horse Presents on the counter at my Beaverton store. It was made up of APA 5 creators. Paul Chadwick, and premier creator, and it won an Emmy or Eisner Award right off the bat. Chris Warner's Black Cross was a cover, which got huge attention, helped the book sell. We hope to sell 10,000 and break that. That's what it would have taken to break even. I gave 100% of the profits to the creators as a show of, I mean what I say. So we didn't. We just paid our bills and they took the money, and we sold 50,000 copies. And then we did a spoof on the comics industry. We turned the turtles into turtle soup in a book called Boris the Bear Slaughters, the name we use for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And so he snapped their heads on the sidewalk and gave turtle soup away to the hungry. And that sold 80,000 copies, and it was a sensation. So we had no real cost. So over 10,000 copies, we were just printing dollar bills, basically. Every comic dollar bill. So when you sell 50,000, you just made $40,000 profit, and you sell 80,000, you just even more. You made $73,000 profit.
You grew very quickly, though, and you referenced the origin of the name Dark Horse. How did the industry, the rest of the industry, react to you? Because it seems like everything you just described should be very threatening, and both something to dismiss or even possibly destroy by trying to pull artists away from you, or various forms of protectionism, I assume.
Well, they did try to pull artists away. I mean, Paul Chadwick became a huge celebrity because he would win every award with this strip called Concrete, about a speechwriter who, through one strange event with an alien ship, ends up in this huge, giant concrete body. It sort of looked like the Thing in Fantastic Four. So the covers look like a traditional superhero book, but it wasn't. It's just about a guy trying to cope with his body and live a normal life. And it resonated with a lot of people, particularly female, in a time when there weren't many female. A small percentage of the readership of comics was not female. Resonated with a lot of women. I always had my own theory on that it was because it was about a character who listened and didn't have any sex organs. So I thought maybe that's the reason why. The dream man, right? The man who just wants to listen. So right off the bat, Harlan Ellison saw our early issues, and he had a radio show in Los Angeles. And he immediately started talking about this company up in Oregon. Harlan became a very close friend as time went by, but he was a big fan of Dark Horse. One of the last books he read was one that I wrote called The Atomic Legion. Harlan's the guy that said something like in print that 90% of everything ever written is shit, and of the 10% that's left, 90% of it is shit. So you don't get compliments for Harlan very, very easily. And he wrote me when I did Atomic Legion. I put a lot of hidden little references in the story and art of previous movies and television series. And he wrote me this little note that said, "You made an old man very, very happy." And I treasure that little note there. Anyway, he's just promoting us like crazy on his radio show, and then called and had to have all of our books. So of course I sent him everything we did, and he had this what he called Ellison Wonderland. Ellison, Harlan Ellison Wonderland. And it was a part of the house to get into. I had to get on my knees and crawl through this little hole. I'm 6'9", so it was hard. But on the other side were these rows of all these comic books, row after row, stacked up to the ceiling, and some other sort of collectibles. And they were all in Wonderland there. And go in every once in a while, and I'd contribute some stuff to that. Anyway, also, we started getting attention right away. I mean, we shot up to 10% of the market at one point really fast. And that's like putting out fires. New stuff's happening because you're growing so fast. You're dealing with stuff you never thought of before. But they were describing, we loved how they were describing it. Somebody wrote, because all the comic business basically was on the East Coast. There was Chicago with a couple publishers, but it was all New York, basically. They called us this outlaw company in the Pacific Northwest. But we started moving people here, and we were taking them. We got David Scroggie up from Pacific that went bankrupt shortly after. We got Lou Bank from Marvel. We got Barbara Kiesel, who had been the editor on The Watchmen. I mean, Diana Schutz. We just brought all of these well-known figures in the industry, in the Dark Horse, and then they started bringing people. And we started removing artists and writers, and Art Adams and Mike Mignola. We got them to move here. And it just exponentially went out. Our people would quit to start, well, if Mike can do it, I can do it. And they go start their own company. And so all these companies started springing up around with people that we had brought here, or people who had been brought here by people we brought here. And they started bringing people here. And pretty soon, the center of the comic book business, after 15 years, was Portland, Oregon, after all of it. And even the mayor of Portland acknowledged that they have Portland as Comic City, USA once a year. And that all started because of Dark Horse. And people can have their own versions. People always say they have their version, but it's true. That's how it happened.
I know every time I meet a comic book artist, I quickly discover they live in Portland. I just had lunch with some comic book artists here, and there were children visiting from their peers in Portland who were peers that I know very well by name. I'm curious about the decision to go into making sequels to IP, Hollywood IP, which felt you were doing something that Marvel had failed to, I feel, respectfully do. You were creating sequels and expanding universes in just really sincere, excellent ways that in some cases kept franchises alive. Where did the decision to do that come from?
Well, it was we were winning awards, but we weren't breaking sales records. I mean, The Mask at its most sold 30,000 copies. It's not like, Marvel was canceling books that sold under 100,000 at that time. Not anymore, but at that time. We were trying to get traction. We had really outstanding books that were winning awards. We had Flaming Carrot and Concrete and Black Cross, and books that did well, but not compared to a Marvel or DC. And just thinking about that, I was thinking, well, part of the reason they have these characters that are 30, 40 years old, in the mid 80s, Superman been around for 46 years, 45 years. Spider-Man had been around since the early 60s, so they had all this time to build up these audiences. Well, how do we get an audience? And we decided to try Godzilla. That was our first licensed book. And we didn't even know how to get translators there at that time. We didn't know where to go. So I took books 1, 3, and 5. Randy took 2, 4, and 6. We just took them home and looked at the pictures and wrote them. So when you see translated by Mike Richardson and Randy, we don't know Japanese, okay? But we know Godzilla. And the funny thing is, years later, we got the script, and it wasn't that much different than what we had just written looking at the pictures. So we never changed it. We could have, but why go to all the trouble? It's the same story. So that sold at the time, I believe it sold about 50,000 copies. We had Steve Bissett doing art, which he never got around to finishing. We got Art Nichols, who was a artist who could clone any style. And so we hired him. He came in and he finished the book and worked for us for a while, and then went to work for Neil Adams, but aping Neil Adams style, which he could do. I mean, this guy could do anybody's style. Anyway, that book sold about 50,000, if I remember, which our biggest success so far. Right off the bat, I said, let's do Aliens. I love that movie so much, Alien and Aliens. They're both. When I saw Alien, I called a friend, said, get down here. How fast you can be here? Can you be here in 15 minutes? My buddy raced down. We went and watched Alien a second time. It just blew me away when I saw it. It was so different and so original. Then Aliens, of course, with when Ripley becomes an actual archetype hero. After Ripley, you had to have a woman kick ass in a science fiction movie. I mean, we had Terminator and a number of movies that all came out, and that became a theme of Dark Horses in a lot of our books, to have kick-ass women being action stars, because, we've seen the guys kicking ass, and there's something, unless it's done in an original way, it's tired, I think. We've seen it enough times, unless you can come up with some way to do it. So we went on a whole period of hero women who were heroes in the comics. But the idea is to pick our favorite movie after we did Aliens, and it sold at 200,000, like 170,000. It was huge. And we heard from retailers, it was, do more. It's bringing new customers into our stores. So, of course, I'm sitting at home. We're trying to figure out what to do next. And I'm sitting at home and I see this monster, look like a monster movie, but called Predator. And it's 20th Century Fox. Well, that's the same company that had Alien. So told Randy, hey, I saw this commercial. Let's go to this movie. Let's go watch it. Maybe it's good and we can do that one. So we went and watched it, and it was great. It was a lot of fun. Definitely count room for a sequel. So we wanted to do the Predator sequel, and we tried to get Arnold's rights for his likeness, but we couldn't get past that, trying to do this book. And I've met Arnold. I used to go to his cigar club for a couple of years at Shotzi's, named after his mom. So he's the nicest man you could ever meet. But we couldn't get his likeness right. So we put his character in the hospital dying of cancer from the radiation from the first movie, and used his brother. And so when I walked out of the theater, I said to Randy, how to stay in the jungle? Predators show up. How to stay in the steel jungle? Predators show up. So that's what we did. And by the way, Chris Warner did the cover of the first book. Well, when we did the movie, we were told we needed to, that we didn't do the movie, but when they did the movie, that started because Joel Silver saw the comic. That's what they used for the basis for the movie. They've been trying to come up with a sequel to the movie. So I had to go sign a thing saying that Joel came up with the ideas, and off they went, which was fine. We kept doing the books, and then we had to pay for an adaptation of the movie that was based on our comic. So there's probably the only time that there's an adaptation of a movie that's an adaptation of a comic book on a movie, on a comic book. So that was that. And then we were trying DC. Bruce Bristow was there at the time, and DC, he offered us the chance to maybe do a team up. So we're talking about all the team ups, and Chris Warner left the room for a minute. We're sitting there trying all these different combinations. Chris said, why do we go to anybody else? Let's just do Aliens versus Predator, same studio. And we all went like, that's a great idea. So walked in, called Pam North. Al Avedi was the head of Fox at the time, licensing. And Pam worked for him, and called Pam and said, Pam, Aliens versus Predator. And she said, you mean King Kong versus Godzilla? I said, exactly. She said, rock and roll. That's what she said. So we went and did that. And that sold about 1 million copies. It sold I can't even tell you, some ungodly number. So that was a big hit. And each one of these were sequels to the movies. They were all, we very carefully placed them in place where the movies were, where they ended, or what the rules were, which was, people didn't always pay attention to that. I talk to the studios all the time. When you don't pay attention to what you set up, you lose your fans. I've had that talk many times. And so that's how it evolved. We still do them to this day. Right now, Last of Us and Critical Role and Witcher. I mean, those are all, we try to build them in. with the creative teams, we tried to build the part of the story. And I think we did pioneer that because I think before that, the companies just put a logo on, then you had a bunch of stories that may or may not, familiar characters that may not have made any sense when looking at the film and connection.
I have two more questions before we transition to Franzetta. I feel like in the 90s, comic book companies were experimenting with Hollywood. There was certainly the DC adaptations, but you seem to also innovate this idea of just going right to Hollywood and creating adaptations as part of the business model rather than something you do distantly later after the fact. Is that just born of your passion for cinema, or
Yeah,
again spotting a hole in the market?
I was all of it's done with passion I had. I loved comics. I loved movies. When I was a kid growing up in Milwaukee, I never went to film school. I'm an art major. I had no connection to New York, but I just always felt that given the chance, well, sometimes you have to go and create your own chance. And with the film business, for instance, I went down to, I was schmucked around for a few years, and a guy named Larry Gordon heard of me and wanted to meet me through Lloyd Levitt, who worked for him. And I'm still in business with Larry all these years. He's been retiring since 2000, but I keep doing projects with him. One of the most powerful producers down there. He owned Largo and Field of Dreams and Die Hard and Trading Places. All of these movies that he did that were huge hits. And once he opened doors for me, I got to say, I pitched my ideas, and we did Time Cop together. We did the very first movie I did was Dr. Giggles, and we shot it right up here outside my office in Milwaukee, Oregon. It was because he told me, you better sit on the set and find out what a producer does if you want to be a producer. Well, that made good sense. So we did. And Larry, I got to say, cut a lot of the corners for me to get through and meet the right people. And, I met most all the studio heads and built my own relationships with writers. Once you have access, then you can have access to the talent because they know you have access to get your films in front of people. So the Mask came out of APA 5. And that was one of my projects. We first did another APA 5. I gave it to him, a Marvel artist by the name of Mark Badger. And he took his shot at it. He changed the spelling of it, which I wasn't thrilled with, but let him do it. And he did his version. It had elements of what I wanted, but it became political, and it just wasn't what I wanted. That was the first one. So then brand new people who were very new to comics, John Arcudi and Doug Mahnke. Chris Warner introduced me to him, and I laid some basic rules. Here's what the story is, and he got them to do a really popular series. Again, sold about 30,000 copies, which is a good success for us in those days. And still some people remember that as the definitive Mask series. Still too violent for the character, and somewhere along the line, and I can't even tell you where, I started thinking I was a big Tex Avery fan. I said, it just occurred to me that you can get very violent. You can blow people up with round bombs in a Tex Avery cartoon, and this is the Mask that I wanted. And got in front of Mike DeLuca at New Line and pitched him this idea with this. And he was worried. He had seen the comic and was worried. A guy named Kevin Benson was in their licensing department. He had pointed out the project to DeLuca, and he read the comics and thought they were too high. I pitched it different. I pitched it that it was going to be a live-action Tex Avery cartoon, basically. I wrote an outline and gave it to him. He said he liked it. Who do you want to write it? And I got a friend, Mark Verheiden, who had started APA 5, and that I had met through Randy. And he was trying to break in as a writer. And I said, let's do it. I didn't get any credit on it because I wasn't a member of the Writers Guild, which I didn't know that. You had to do that, and nobody told me. But on the next one, Mark and I did the next one, and Mark stuck up for me. And even though I still wasn't a member, it was my story, Time Cop. And Time Cop knocked the Mask out of first place, and then suddenly I was in all the magazines. I was in Premiere. Remember when that was the movie magazine, Newsweek, and all these, as the new guy in town. And I could get anyone I wanted in the world. I mean, literally, we were talking to everybody. and I got Pam Anderson. We did Barbed Wire.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that one is it was done with Polygram at the time, which had never really done a big project before, and they kept cutting our budget, so we had to keep cutting the script down. So it started out as Road Warrior, and it ended up as a bar owner who is a bounty hunter, which was always an element, but we always had that World War or Civil War, the Second Civil War theme. Anyway, I think that was our first, or one of our very first projects, was to do the mask, or to do Barbed Wire. But after that, we were firmly ingrained, and everybody wanted to hear the ideas. And that's when I really started opening it up to creators, the same as with the comics. If you have a good idea, let me know. I'll go see if I can sell it. And we had pretty good, during that period between 92 and maybe 2005, somewhere there, I set up about almost 100 projects, and we made over 30 of them, which is a pretty good record. We were always in production with something. A number of them were Hellboy movies with Larry, and Mystery Men with Larry, which I think was way ahead of its time. It's a great movie, and it's been reassessed lately. Nobody got the humor back then because there were no superhero movies. But now, I still get mail about that movie, that how ahead of its time it was, and even new reviews of it for reviewers who see it for the first time and say, wait a minute, this should have come out now with all the Marvel movies. Yeah.
I'm grateful it worked, because I don't know, maybe my career would have worked out in some other direction, but you and Keith deciding to go with Hyde and getting it sold for me and getting on the blacklist. From that, I got a television series, and my career. Maybe I would have had a different version of the career,
Right.
but I have the version I have in the life because you guys liked an idea and said that should be a comic book and maybe a movie.
We still like that idea, Cole. I got to tell you, I just was talking about that was an opportunity. I don't give up on things. It took over 10 years to get Tarzan made. I mean, over 10 years. And Hellboy was like 5 years. I mean, you just don't give up. Concrete, we've gotten close with Concrete so many times. And the first time with Peter Jackson, I mean, Peter and Fran wrote the screenplay. We had it at Disney. We were going to go forward with it, and then he got an offer to go down to New Zealand and shoot Lord of the Rings. But he said, he may not remember, but he said, as soon as I get this in, we'll be back and do this. And he never came back, and became Peter Jackson, and made brilliant movies.
Well, we should probably call it quits for the moment.
It's a Frazetta.
Well, no, I will come back in a moment and chat about that some more. But thank you for the conversation so far, Mike. This has been great.
Sure.
As for the rest of you listening today, wherever you are, thanks so much for spending your time with me here at 5 a.m. Story Talk. Don't make a run for it just yet, though. As promised, there's a bonus episode to come. Mike returns to discuss a seminal piece of artwork from his life, but with that twist I mentioned earlier. We're going to talk the oeuvre of artist Frank Frazetta, the godfather of fantasy art. You're going to need to become a paid subscriber wherever you're listening to this, though. Alternatively, you can head to the show notes and subscribe to my 5 a.m. Story Talk Arts newsletter, where you'll get access to all my podcast episodes days, weeks, and sometimes even months early, including every bonus episode like this one. You'll also get access to a ton of other arts articles, most of them focused on screenwriting and writing, many of them exclusive to paid subscribers. Upcoming guests of this podcast include Late Night with the Devil writers-directors Colin and Cameron Cans, cyborg anthropologist Amber Case, and super producer and Get Lifted partner Mike Jackson. Next week, another minisode is coming your way, titled When Did We Stop Dreaming of a Better Future? It will explore the provocative question, did science fiction help make a 21st century dystopia inevitable? I killed myself on this episode, so I hope you both enjoy it and find yourselves challenged by the argument I make. Thanks again for listening, my friends. See you at the bonus episode for some more 5 a.m. Story Talk with Dark Horse Comics founder and CEO, Mike Richardson.